Joining us now is Andrew Salapak, social media professor, University of Florida, to discuss calls on the Supreme Court to block a state law restricting minors' access to social media. Andrew, good afternoon. It's been a minute. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. So, can you give us your thoughts, first of all, to start off, the legal arguments being made here, the group challenging Mississippi state law? Net Choice is arguing that it infringes on free speech rights of minors and platforms.
Well, obviously, you have the two sides of the case. You basically have the state of Mississippi saying that they're concerned about the content that particularly minors are seeing. They're concerned about minors accessing social media and the potential for cyberbullying, the potential for, being harassed by adults. They're concerned about just the overall content that they could be consuming. And they're also worried about the addictive nature of social media. On the other side, you have essentially a group representing the social media platforms that's concerned about the burdensome aspects of the bill. You have the aspect of trying to prove you have a parent or a guardian that allows the child to be on. Then you also have to have the child prove their age, which would require age verification, an entirely additional system. And then, sort of buried in all of this, is the fact that the social media companies can be fined for the content that even those young people who get through the agreement and prove their age, the content that they see. And one of the things listed is cyberbullying. And I think that, even though it's sort of lower down in the discussion and kind of lower down in all of this, is also really important, because if you have the potential that these platforms could be fined because a minor is cyberbullied, I'm not really sure how they could prevent that. And that probably is also a big concern, because those fines, even though you're talking about billion-dollar companies, those fines would add up for a child getting bullied by a classmate, a child being bullied by a friend, in DMs or posts. So there's a lot that's going on to the bill, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's basically been stuck for a year now.
Okay, let me respond to some of the points there. What do you make of the Packingham v. North Carolina case, where the Supreme Court ruled that social media is a modern public square and access cannot be unduly restricted?
Well, and I think that's sort of a decision. Is it a public square? You have to kind of go into sort of the originator of the concept of the public sphere and the public square. You'd have to look back historically. What does the public sphere, what does the public square mean, in terms of access to information, being able to speak in that? And we're also dealing with minors. So normally we think of the public square, the public sphere, as this place to discuss, to debate, to engage with the community, to come to conclusions on topics. Yet that's really for us to be able to have a society, a democratic society, and we already limit people under the age of 18 from voting. So the public square idea does kind of fall into this conversation, but even there, we have to think about what is the point and purpose of the public sphere, the public square, and it's for sort of people who are participating in the running of society, the running of government, which is already limited to people under the age of 18.
So can you build on that? Do minors have the same First Amendment rights to adults when it comes to accessing content online?
Well, I mean, and admittedly, I am not a lawyer, but I would say, one of the things that you're dealing with there when you're looking at minors, we do restrict what minors can and cannot do, not just from a speech perspective, but also from, medical perspectives. A minor can't just go get a tattoo. A minor can't just go get an ear piercing. A minor cannot just drive when they want. A minor cannot purchase alcohol. They cannot vote. Their First Amendment rights are also limited when they're on school grounds. So we have basically put in place these exceptions where we treat minors differently for good reasons. And so when we talk about free speech, yes, a minor does have free speech rights in terms of whether or not they would be prosecuted by the government or whether they would be fined or arrested by the government. But we're not talking about governments and what you can and cannot say to not get arrested. We're talking about using a company's platform to post. And this is, again, where there's sort of a difference between the town hall, the public sphere, the public square, and using social media. And the reason for that is because we also allow these social media companies to have a terms of service. They have their own limitations that they place on what you can and cannot say that are often more restrictive than what would be covered by the First Amendment. So it's not a true public sphere. And at the same time, we also place limitations on young people in terms of what they can do and even what they can say in certain environments, such as on school grounds.
What are your thoughts on whether if it is the responsibility of social media platforms to prevent harm to users?
Well, I think at this point, and one of the things that you have Net Choice basically arguing is that there's no proof that social media is harmful or dangerous to kids. I think we kind of all would disagree on that one at this point. We can recognize just from the addictive nature of social media that it can have harm on anybody, young people included, and probably young people in particular. We got to remember that a young person's brain, or really all of our brains, are not fully developed until our mid 20s. So we're looking at somebody who is 13, 14, 15 years old. They don't necessarily recognize the long term implications of the things that they do on social media, how it can harm them later in life in terms of getting into college, grad school, future relationships, future employment. And then when you also add in the content that they might consume, if they're prepared for it, particularly, other looking at aspects of body image, looking at aspects of cyberbullying, it's a place that, really should have some guardrails placed on it in terms of what young people are accessing, what they're doing on there. The question is this the responsibility of the government? Is this the responsibility of the platforms? Is this the responsibility of the parent or guardian? And I think you have a lot of debate on that area of, why do you, because if we're saying you need to allow your 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old to be on these platforms, why are parents so willing to allow their young child who's still in a very impressionable part of their development and when their brains are not fully formed to be on these platforms that parents themselves should know are addictive and potentially harmful?
So on that point, perhaps it's the parents' responsibility, but it's very difficult because social media right now is everywhere, right? Even if you don't give your child a phone, they could see social media on somebody else's phone. So where is the distribution? Where is the line between government involvement, parent involvement, and tech platform involvement when it comes to online safety for children?
Well, there's no magic bullet. There's no one solution. I think it's sort of a combination of everything. Parents, guardians need to be aware of what their children are consuming online. There's different things that you can add to a child's phone to kind of see what they're doing, to limit how much time they spend on there. You also have to think, as you mentioned, I mean, a child can look at it on a desktop, a laptop. It's not just on a phone. The tech companies, I think, are also have responsibility in this because they make determinations in terms of what type of content is allowed in the first place. We're talking about the content that is harmful to children. It doesn't mean that simply because you're 18 that content is no longer harmful to a person. It just means that we're saying that people under the age of 18 are somehow more impressionable than an 18-year-old, 19-year-old. The content can be more harmful. I would say that content that's harmful for a 16-year-old probably is harmful to a 18-year-old. We just consider an 18-year-old that sort of level to be an adult, being able to vote and engage in other activities. And at the same time, the government needs to have some responsibility. The government basically since the 90s has sort of allowed social media to be this wild west with, Section 230. And in doing so, they've kind of ceded the responsibility of regulation and monitoring to the companies. And the companies, for the most part, if we're really being honest, their only real goal is profit. They're not trying to be a community service. They're not trying to be a public sphere. They're trying to make money. And bringing more users onto the platform will make them more money. So their intention and goal at the very, the most important thing for them is to increase users. And that means if they can bring more 13 to 17-year-olds onto the platform, that just increases their bottom line.
So earlier you mentioned guardrails, and I think that's one of the core points in this case. What are your thoughts? How effective are age verification measures on social media?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing is that age verification on a digital space is kind of new. For the most part, age verification in the past was sort of the honor system. You would go to a website, do you agree you're 18? Do you agree you're 21? And click yes or no. Sometimes they might say, "Hey, put in a birth date." And that would be your way to prove how old you are. And that could be everything from an alcoholic site to a pornographic site. We've seen this in the past. Now, some of the things that we're seeing when it comes to pornography, which is different than social media, and I think we would all agree that there's a difference between the two. There's also the fact that pornographic websites are more of a commercial site. But in Texas and in other states, we're now seeing where they're being required, not just for minors, but for everybody to prove their age. They have to provide identification, they have to demonstrate their age. Some of them are using AI technology to basically do a facial recognition scan to kind of determine the age of somebody, in which case you're still giving over biometric data. So we're starting to see the use of age verification online, at least for pornographic websites. But then you have sort of a civil liberties problem of, do you really want to have your name, your address, your picture associated with the content that you're consuming? So we're seeing sort of the beginnings of this age verification, and we can also see the huge problems that would go along with it as well.
And just finally, maybe you can go into some of the problems. I'm thinking maybe there's concerns of surveillance or privacy issues as a result of age verification online.
Oh, of course. And that's, to a large extent, I think most people would agree that, especially here in the United States, we probably have more concerns about privacy. Not necessarily everyone, but I think in general, we probably have more privacy concerns than people in other countries. And there's a lot of concern of giving this personal information to a website. Again, my picture, my address, confirming that, and then for you to also track everything I do, everything I say, everything I look at, everything I click on when I come to your website. There's a reason why people have VPNs, to try to protect some of their identity. There's a reason why we try to do things and use different search engines and engage in other activities, not getting rewards cards and so forth, to try to protect our identity and protect our data to some extent. So here in the US, I think it's something we maybe care about a little bit more. Doesn't necessarily mean that our government is helping to protect our data. We see more of that occurring in the EU, but I think it does come down to being concerned. Like if I wanted to go to a alcoholic website to just see what new products they have out or where they sell a particular product, I don't think I would go to the site and see I have to prove my age, give a copy of my driver's license, and use that website. I would find somewhere else. The difference when it comes to social media is that there's not sort of the limitless options out there. There's really a handful of major social media platforms. Whereas if I'm looking for a particular beer, a particular wine, and find a website and they require age verification, I can probably go somewhere else. But I think a lot of people would be concerned about handing over that type of data to a random website, a random social media platform, and not know how long it's going to be stored, what it's going to be used for, or who it's going to be shared with.
Well, Andrew, we have to leave it there for today. It was good to talk to you. Thank you.
You as well.